Hello and welcome to Acclime's podcast series, Advancing Vietnam, with me, Vlad Savin, as your host. In this episode, I'm discussing with Matthew Lourey, Managing Partner at Acclime Vietnam, about the regulatory provisions and international best practices for repatriating funds for foreign investors operating in Vietnam. Matthew, welcome again to a new podcast episode of Advancing Vietnam.
Great to be here again, Vlad, as always.
Very interesting and very critical topic for international investors. This is probably one of the first questions that we hear in our introductory meetings with the investors. How do I invest in the country, and then how do I get the money out?
It is, and in fact, the conversations quite often, as you know, people come in, I've got money stuck, I can't get it out. I've been told I can't get it out. That problem exists. There's a perception issue of certain markets, Vietnam, socialist country, the regulations. The flip that around, if you do it right, there's no issue. It's a matter of understanding the process. And in fact, it is far easier than many other regulated markets in practice. So that discussion about the problems generally come from people not understanding what the regulations are, or having preconceived ideas that don't match the reality. As with everything we say in Vietnam, is understand the process. Before you start, follow it, and it will work. And that in a socialist based system, it's all process driven, and this is what we see in Vietnam. So the that perception that it's hard and how to do it, it was often ill-conceived.
So let's start with this key topic that investors are looking at. Is it hard or is it easy? Let's look at identifying a bit the potential mistakes or issues that investors experience or undertake within this process.
Yeah, so the basic foundation is that a foreign company must open, when it first starts, and is a direct investment capital account, a specific bank account. It's regulated, and that's your golden ticket. That is so important. All your capital, share capital, your loans come in through there. Your capital come back out through there, your loans back out, and your dividends. That's the golden ticket. If you get that wrong, if you don't set up the account within 90 days and put your money in within 90 days, you've got 90 days for your share capital, by the way. We can talk about that in a moment, but you've got to set it up at the start. If you don't bring money in, your capital or your loans, through that account, it won't come back out. And that's unfortunately the reality. Now, there is a secondary for non-foreign owned companies. You can have an overseas or an offshore loan account, which is exactly the same, different name. It's the same regulator with the state bank, a specific account that is a regulator cross-border. Put it through there, you're generally okay. If you don't put it through there, you've got big trouble.
And from a broad, high-level regulatory perspective, what are the key implications for investors sending funds abroad from Vietnam, looking at that corporate side?
So you can only send funds from abroad if it's for operational purposes, and there's tax elements to that, or if it's your money from a capital perspective. So look at the capital perspective. If I'm bringing in my share capital through that direct investment capital account, if I bring in loans, I can send them back out. Like my dividends can come back out through there. The loans need to be registered with the state bank if they have a length beyond 12 months. And if they are beyond 12 months, you've got to make sure that they're within your capital structure. So you might have a licensing and updates and issues. And there's a registration process, and the loan documentation must meet local requirements. It's not that hard. You just got to prepare. Don't assume that, our group loan documents, we've got a standard group documents, but they still may not be relevant for Vietnam. But once you've done it, the template becomes a very quick process. Money comes in through the capital account. You notify your bank. The short-term loan doesn't get registered, long-term loan gets registered, or your share capital comes in per your investment. You sell your company, money comes back out, repatriate your loan, money comes out, declare a dividend, wait 7 days, tax office does not object, money comes out. If it's a commercial payment, either you're paying for goods that you've imported, you'll have import docs and taxes and be paid. If it's for services, you will likely need to pay withholding tax. Again, that's a tax declaration, and that can happen parallel to the payment going out, but there's a requirement to make sure that withholding tax is paid on foreign payments. But I think that's the full spectrum. There's not that many elements. People get it wrong, though. They don't understand the tax implications for services and goods, or they use the wrong account, or don't understand the documentation that is implied in those in the direct investment capital account.
You mentioned the importance of the direct investment capital account, the DICA. How do investors set it up? Is it something difficult? Does it require a significant amount of KYC paperwork? and why there are cases where they actually get it wrong?
Plenty of cases that get it wrong, and that it's probably, if you get that wrong when you set up phase, it can be critical, can ruin the company. We've seen that too many times, unfortunately, where people leave it to the last minute and something doesn't work. So the direct investment capital account is an additional account that foreign investors open. It's just a bank account for all intents and purposes, but that's going to be a regulated account. The KYC with banks depends on bank. Local banks, it's a day or so. It's really just you've already gone through your government approval to set up the company. They generally accept that. Foreign banks, there's a bit more process to their internal KYCs. But if we took a large local bank, within a day you can have that set up. That by itself is not the issue. Setting up the account and saying this is my regulated direct investment capital account, here are my current operating accounts, many as you want, one DICA, you set that up. The key part of that is that the initial, you can only bring those, as I said before, capital, loans, dividends can go through, nothing else can go through that. But within the first 90 days from the date your company is established, you must bring in the committed share capital, charter capital, into that account from the investor, not from someone else, from the investor as named, within 90 days. And if you're cutting it fine, which is what people who send it, I sent it on day 90, the banking system can sometimes have delays, and therefore it hits on day 91 and the bank cannot accept that. Then you must apply to the state bank for an exception and penalties, and if they do, then you've got to justify why. We do see that. So never cut it fine. It becomes a nightmare because when you open it, it's a regulated account and it goes back to day one for that initial period. That's the biggest issue we see constantly, is that people miss that 90-day deadline, and that account effectively is frozen at that point because you're non-compliant with that. So that's the other issue with setting it up. Setting up is easy. Making sure you're within that 90-day compliant period for the initial money you have to bring into Vietnam, that's what we see as the biggest challenge.
That's right. And if you brought as well loans through that account and your capital is not injected at the right time and the account is frozen, your loans repayments as well are potentially deemed frozen.
Yeah, the world of pain, correct.
Let's look at for a couple of minutes on repatriating funds through intercompany transactions. How do investors do that? What type of contracts, agreements, and what is the feasibility of using this model to send funds across?
Again, you're looking at services payments essentially. So you've got two elements in law to think about. One is withholding tax. If I'm paying for services provided by a foreign payer, I have to deal with my foreign contract withholding tax, which is both VAT and CIT. VAT for most applies on most transactions, and I can claim it back. The corporate income tax, it's usually 5% and 5%. Corporate income tax is a tax on the other party's profits, and I'll get a tax deduction for it, but it's the other party's profits. If they're in a country with a double tax agreement, you can be exempted. You can make application in advance and be exempted. So you've got to deal with those, and you've got to make sure those are done. But the other part is that you've got to make sure within the transfer pricing regulations that the pricing and the fees charged are relevant. You can't just do an end of year intercompany charge, bang, you take that charge, we'll want to balance the books. For what purpose? Was that valid purposes? Was withholding tax paid? Was it declared for VAT purposes? And does it meet transfer pricing requirements? So it's not just an end of year adjustment. It's something that you must manage, you must plan during the year, and you must make sure there's a commercial underlying benefit. Otherwise, the transaction will be deemed as not relevant and as not necessary for the business. And the authorities have broad deeming provisions if it's not commercial and not justified. So it is a little bit more complicated than just doing a journal entry at the year end. It doesn't quite work like that.
You mentioned in the beginning of the conversation about paying out dividends, sending funds across if you do things right from the beginning. Specifically looking at dividends and profits, what is the process for sending these offshore and how easy it is for international investors?
And that's, to be honest, that's probably the biggest concern people have is you can't get a dividend out. So to pay a dividend, you must have profits in the most recent year. So it must be from a profit year, and you must have retained profits to repatriate. So if you meet those requirements, you can make one dividend payment per year. So so what you do is you make a declaration of dividend distribution. You notify the tax authorities, notify the bank, and the tax authorities have 7 days to object. Should they not object within 7 days, i.e. there's a window there for the authority to say, sorry, you're not you've got a tax issue, you're not up to date. So that's the objection. If they don't object, the bank will just release that within 7 days or release payment. And that process is relatively straightforward. The issue, what we see, the tax authorities, if you're currently under tax inspection, if you haven't lodged documents, if you have outstanding penalties, if you have outstanding payments, they will object to it and not let you pay it out. We've had interesting experiences for clients whereby the authorities have withdrawn certain matters to allow payments to be released, in fact. So a discussion, they say, oh, you've got a declaration, you would pay dividend. They've gone, yeah, well, that's fair. Well, let us withdraw this so we don't object. And we see it's not they're not trying to be onerous about that. They're just trying to make sure compliant companies. In practice, we don't see issues in practice. For companies that don't know their compliance status or don't know where the situation, the tax authorities are always with them, always negotiating, always having issues, yeah, they may have problems. But if you've got a good process and a good compliance culture, it's just a payment process declaration. So normally you do your year end, 31 March, you pay your taxes. In April, make a declaration, notify the tax office in your bank, wait your 7 days, and then release the funds. That's a pretty normal process.
Mm-hmm. And looking at loans as the second method that generally investors use of bringing funds across Vietnam, the government issued recently in June the Circular 8 that looks at a few variations on how loans compliance works, specifically foreign loans. Can you share a few details on how that works and what's the impact and the process for loan compliance, foreign loan compliance for investors in Vietnam?
Luckily, Circular 8 didn't change for the vast majority of companies. There was some thin capitalisation, potential changes coming in and registration changes. We didn't see most of them in the final version. So fortunately for us, the circular wasn't that onerous from what we've had now. And the requirement is that you can only repatriate loans that you've brought in. There needs to be a commercial interest rate. And in fact, if there's not an interest rate deemed in the state in the contract, the deeming rate is a 10%. That may have interest because it's a deeming for state bank purposes. It may actually cause you other tax problems as well, because if you have no interest, there may be tax for transfer pricing. So again, don't leave interest out. Make sure there's a market rate of interest built into that contract, and that it further goes through and just clarifies non-government guaranteed loans. You bring them in. Registration more than 12 months must register, the process and the capital requirements in your license, just to make sure that you're not outside what you first said when you invested. Other than that, as I said earlier, you bring the money in, you have a loan agreement. That loan agreement is compliant. Now, for a short-term loan, that doesn't go to the authority, so between you and the bank, just to make sure the bank is satisfied. If it is longer than 12 months, the loan agreement must be approved by the state bank before the funds flow. Hence why I said earlier, the agreements that your global group does may not meet the requirements. In fact, often we've seen they're too complicated. The state bank doesn't want that level of complication. They want a level of simplicity, but there's also certain matters that they're expecting to see in those loan contracts. So once you've done one of those and the state bank has approved, use that template. It just becomes an easier process when you send it through, it goes through the registration process. That first registration can take a number of months for some groups. After that, it can take 14 days, 7 days. So now what we often see is that short-term loans come in because they don't require registration with the authorities and don't require vetting. You bring a short-term loan in and then it gets converted and registered with little asterisks, just be careful, or converted to capital, so you can increase your share capital, or repatriated later on. The asterisk I say with that is long-term is that you must meet the long-term requirements in that it must be used for. Your short-term can't have been used for capital purposes. It can't be doing for long-term investing. Short-term loans are only for operating purposes, not for building a factory. So if you've got to show to the state bank that you only use those funds for short-term, even though you're now converting to long-term, and you're within your limits and within your approvals for your total investment that you said you'd bring in.
And that's why it's important within loan agreements to ensure that you specifically mention with clarity the scope of the loan, how you're going to use it, because if that doesn't meet the requirements of conversion, then you're exposed.
We do see situations where the state bank asks for bank statements to show how the short-term loans were dispersed. And if it's intermingled funds, that can sometimes cause problems where you can't actually show. The onus is on you to show that it wasn't used for long-term purposes. And if you've commingled those funds and you can't show that it wasn't used for long-term purposes, that can be an issue of registration, which can require another short-term loan to come in to pay out the other short-term loan, and then you capitalise that new loan, which requires extra funds to flow through. There are solutions in many cases, but money is the end of the day as a cash flow implication.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, you've been in Vietnam for almost 20 years already, so you've seen a lot from a business perspective and from an international investor's perspective. You are one as well. What are some of the misconceptions that you hear from international investors, not necessarily the new ones entering the market, but still some of those that are in Vietnam regarding repatriating funds?
Less misconceptions, more that successful business people can't get the money out because they have to use local nominees. It's in local names. They can't get the money out. They need the black market. And they come in on that basis. They operate on that basis. And when they're successful, I've sold my business, I've got all this money. What do I do? So it's that whole element is wrong from the start. Local nominees, we've had various podcasts about that. It's not the discussion that you should be having to enter Vietnam. So to enter Vietnam is just do it right, get it set up, inject your money. We've helped many companies, our transaction advisory team doing transaction support, sell side, buy side, businesses, the capital, the foreign investor sells a business, the money goes back and they get the money out and they can be very, very successful. So getting your capital out, doing a capital reduction, a share buyback, repaying your loans, paying dividends, none of them cause any issue in practice. They're just normal parts of business. And that surprisingly people don't understand or know that and expect the worst and operate as if the worst is going to happen, therefore put money under my mattress at home or in a friend's name, and I'll deal with getting out of the country later. There's no easy way to get it out through the black market. I can tell you now that the pain and suffering people go through to try to beat the system, it's not worth it. It's not worth it, and that causes more stress and sleepless nights and losses. People can lose a lot of money in that process.
You mentioned at the beginning Vietnam's positioning across the region into the flexibility of bringing funds in and out. And from what I know, in Thailand, for example, there's probably a few other jurisdictions. There are caps for bringing for paying out dividends, profits, and other types of funds. Does Vietnam has a type of cap system?
No, there's no caps. So you can only send loans that you've already brought in. You can only send capital out that you've brought in or that someone else has brought in to buy your capital. And your dividends based on profits. If you've made profit, you can send it out. So no, you don't have the cap. So you see in Indonesia, we see in China where you're doing commercial payments can take a number of days for paperwork. Vietnam, if you got the docs, you send it, you can get it same day. So the roadblocks in practice are nothing like we see potentially in other jurisdictions. It is very much a misconception. But as I said at the start, it's a process driven. It's a socialist society is built around process. Understand the process, follow it, and it just works. It does work. The complaints and the issues and the concerns are those who have seen people not follow that process and they get caught. And I see constantly for transactions for new market entrants, particularly when a foreign party is looking to buy an existing entity, we don't believe you can get dividends out. We heard rumours. Okay, well, here's a dividend payment. Here's a dividend. Here's 2 or 3 examples just from that we can show you there, and that is often just the misconception from other parties that it's a problem. And maybe that's from other jurisdictions. Maybe that people are doing things wrong, but it's just a process.
Matthew, unfortunately our time is up, but thank you for the very interesting and very practical discussion on this topic.
Great, fantastic. Thanks again, Vlad.
We encourage all investors in Vietnam to stay abreast of their tax and foreign loan compliance obligations and to review these obligations on an ongoing basis so that unexpected objections are not received when seeking to declare and send out funds out of the Vietnamese structures. And many thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in to Advancing Vietnam podcast series. For more information about this topic, please check out our publications on vietnam.acclime.com. And if you want to reach out to us for any additional details, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn or throughout the website contact details.